Hi, this is Dr. Rebecca Wood, and I would like to welcome you to the Week 5 lecture. This week we will continue our study of poetic devices and literary effects in poetry. And the first thing to think about, as we may have already been thinking about, is what makes a poem a poem. Does the work have a unique form, such as a traditional sonnet or haiku? Does the work contain figurative language, including metaphors and similes, or personification? Does the work have rhythm and/or rhyme? The most common rhyming scheme is at the end of the lines, but you can find rhymes internally too. Repetition, alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia. Could you sing or dance to the poem? Does the poem use weighted language that packs a punch, such as Blake's lines here? What immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Does the work stretch the bounds of language and imagination, such as these two lines from Jabberwocky? The Jabberwock with eyes of flame came whiffling through the tulgey wood. And what about our poetry this week? Our poetry this week spans many years and many different poetic forms. As we study these poems this week, think about which ones are written in totally free verse and which ones are written in more standard poetic forms. And how does the poem's form affect its meanings and what it means to you? And what is the theme of each poem this week? Can you find maybe a common theme? Maybe there isn't one. What does each poem mean inside itself? And how could we relate possibly two or more of these poems by subject matter, style, era, or theme? And is there any evidence that later poems have been influenced by the earlier poems? Because many poets spend their time, when they're not writing, reading other poets' work. And are any of these poems completely different than the others? And I like to also wonder is this question here, do you dislike or like any of these poems and why? The first poem on our list this week is I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which was written by William Wordsworth. And this poem is written in a more traditional form with four stanzas of 6 lines each. The poem has both a consistent rhyming scheme and a consistent rhythm of the syllables in each line. And so when you read it, you have that lovely rhythm and rhyme, but then you have to be careful that you don't get too sing-songy with it when you do read it. And the poem is written in first person viewpoint. So it's written as if the poet himself is the narrator. And the daffodil imagery repeats throughout the poem from the 4th line all the way to the last word in the 4th stanza. And the 4th stanza is, For oft, when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude, and then my heart with pleasure fills, and dances with the daffodils. And it's still a lovely poem. And then we have God is Indeed a Jealous God by Emily Dickinson. And if you look in the lecture and resources folder, you'll also see another one of her poems, which is one of my very favorites, A Narrow Fellow in the Grass. But in the book, we have this poem here, which is just one stanza of 4 lines. And one reason that Emily Dickinson's poems are very interesting, among others, is that she lived her entire adult life essentially as a recluse. So she didn't publish any of her work while she was alive. Her sister found her poetry, and then she and some allies got Emily's work published after her death. And this is a small poem about some big ideas, including the relationship between God and humanity. And Emily Dickinson was a religious person, even though she mostly stayed at home. And so thinking about how her life was and what she did and how she was artistic but all by herself, essentially, this is her poem, God is Indeed a Jealous God. He cannot bear to see that we had rather not with him, but with each other play. And so it's kind of a thought of whether she maybe stayed home so that she could commune with God more than with other human beings. And then we have two poems by William Blake. And these two poems are often studied together, and they're two of my favorites, I'll admit it. And they were published in different books, William Blake's Songs of Innocence and his Songs of Experience. And so first the Songs of Innocence came out, and that book included The Lamb, and it is formatted in two traditional stanzas featuring a peaceful, sweet tone and rhyming couplets. And so this poem is lovely, and it has religious imagery that's traditional, and at its center is the metaphor of Jesus as the Lamb of God. And so it's a lovely poem. It's often used to celebrate Christianity, and it's very nice. And then we also have a different poem that he wrote, and oh, pardon me, it's called The Tiger. And the tiger, as it was originally spelled with a Y, which I kind of like that spelling too, has a completely different tone than the lamb, and appeared 5 years later as one of the songs of experience. And so you have the songs of innocence, which are like when mankind, before the fall, before Eve ate the apple, so to speak. And then we have the songs of experience, which is more like the real world, possibly. And the tiger is formatted in 6 stanzas of 4 lines each, and the rhythm and word choices are harsher and full of dark images and power, with words like dread, fearful, fire, and immortal. The tiger ponders a universal question: did he who made the lamb make thee? How could the same benevolent creator who made fluffy little lambs also have forged the tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night? Which is, of course, a question that we can't answer very easily. And then there is the poem Jabberwocky. I'll admit I like that poem too. It appeared first in the first chapter of Lewis Carroll's book Through the Looking Glass, which is a sequel to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And so the poem is, as I've highlighted here or italicized, interesting, since when you look into the book itself, you start reading, and then the first chapter, the poem is found in the mirror image world after Alice goes through the looking glass, and then she has to use a mirror to read the poem because it's still backwards, which might hurt your head if you think about it all too much. And this poem has 7 stanzas of 4 lines each, and has some elements of epic poetry like Beowulf or Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, which is kind of cool to me. A young hero going off to battle a monster or an enemy, a named blade that reminds me and others also of Excalibur, which was King Arthur's sword, and a joyous celebration of victory. This poem also has a wealth of imaginary words, words that wouldn't ordinarily be found in the dictionary unless they've been added because of this poem, such as brillig, momraths, jabberwock, uffish, vorpal, and frabjous. And so do you like this topsy-turvy poem, or possibly you do not like it? And I would like to hear about that either way. And then we have another poem which has a much more serious tone. It's Preface to a 20-volume Suicide Note. And when I read that title, it kind of scares me. It caught my attention, and probably yours too, and appears to foreshadow tragedy, which is why I was so happy to find some videos of Amiri Baraka doing some poetry readings much later in his life. So that kind of eases our concern about that title. And the poem has 4 stanzas of 5 lines, and then 4 lines, and then 6 lines. Before and after the middle stanza is a single line that stands alone. So it does not have a standard form, but it has a form within itself. And the poem uses the poetic device of repetition For example, 3 out of 4 lines in the middle stanza start with "and." The narrator brings the audience along on a journey from outside, walking the dog, catching the bus, so outside doing mundane things, and then to the heavens, counting the stars or the holes they leave, to inside his home where his daughter is talking to someone. And then we get the impression that is his daughter praying into her own clasped hands? So again, have we taken another trip to the heavens at the end of this poem? So it's a lovely poem, and there's a lot to think about inside the poem. And then we have Howl. And this is part of the poem Howl. It's much longer than the excerpt that we have, and I would definitely call this poem free verse, and some people might even go so far as to call it a prose poem written in the form of prose, but I wouldn't go that far. And this poem does appear to have abandoned traditional forms and ideas, but even as it rebels against every possible tradition, maybe, it also contains multiple allusions or references to classic literary works and those same traditions, including religion with these very interesting combinations here, like Hot Rod Golgotha. And Golgotha is where Jesus was crucified. In incarnate gaps, I'm sorry, let me start that over. Incarnate gaps in time and space. And our book contains only a portion of this poem, as I said, and it was part of a collection that was published in 1955. And so you can kind of see the precursor. This was published in the middle of the 50s, but it shows that there were some things going on that led to the excitement or cultural upheavals of the 60s. And the narrator of this poem also brings the audience along on a journey, passing through the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, heaven under the L, and through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake light. And notice that there is a clear allusion to William Blake there in this line. And here's my works cited. This week we had a number of poems, as I'm sure you're aware. And so the works cited here also includes information I got from the Emily Dickinson biography. And also I have a quote from the Bible, which I've documented. So I had to get out or go to the Purdue Owl and document carefully, just as we always should when we are writing about literature or using research material. And then I have one question for you. Your poetry, what do you have to say? Sometimes I write poetry, some of which is certainly not worth sharing or that no one else wants to read, but that's okay. So if you have any poetry that you're writing, or we happen to be living in times that might inspire poetry, you might want to try your hand at it. And I hope you all have a wonderful week. Thank you. Bye-bye.